Some background. I went to graduate school at Syracuse University, as was mentioned, and studied many different areas of philosophy. But I've always been most interested in consciousness and mind area. It seems so central to so many other areas, even in metaphysics, like free will question and so on. So what I'm going to do here today is present a little bit about the nature of higher order thought, the higher order thought theory of consciousness, and then there are several questions that follow from that I want to follow up on. In other words, where it might be realized in the brain. Now, one thing I should say up front is that higher order thought theory is not necessarily committed to the realization of it as being in the brain. The brain could be even at subneural levels, could be someone could be, theoretically, I don't think there are any, but someone could be theoretically a higher order thought theorist and be a dualist. But the purpose of this talk, or one purpose, is to examine how the higher order thought theory might be realized in the brain in particular. Some terminology, which is always very important, obviously, in these matters, as we've heard all week. There is oftentimes a lot of confusion, right? A lot of question about what do we mean by consciousness and various definitions that are given. And these are only a few possibilities. I have to say, even amongst philosophers, we like to think we're good at careful distinctions and terminology, and I think for the most part we are, but there's a tendency to introduce new terms that overlap in ways that aren't always helpful, and we need to be careful and define the terms. There's one distinction, for example, that's very important, I think, worth making up front, that sometimes in philosophy of mind areas there is a distinction between what's called creature consciousness and state consciousness. And all that means is that sometimes when we use the term conscious, we are applying that term to a whole creature or organism, or, the dog is conscious, right? Or other times, however, we're referring to a mental state. So we might say his desire is conscious, or something of that sort. The thought is conscious. And that's important, partly because most contemporary theories of consciousness that I'm aware of, especially in the Western tradition, focus much more on what's called state consciousness. It doesn't mean it's not related, to creature consciousness. But as was mentioned earlier this week, it's possible to have a state that's conscious and maybe the organism not. So organism being conscious means, you moving around, you're awake, and so on. But somebody, a state of sleepwalking could be, somebody might at least arguably make the case that you have a case of creature consciousness but no state consciousness. Many people say the reverse is true when you have a case of lucid dreaming. Right? You have a case of state consciousness, but of course, from the outside, you say the person's lying in the bed, right? And there's no creature consciousness as such. So they in principle could come apart, but of course, most of the time, if you are state conscious or you have conscious mental states, you're going to be a conscious organism at the same time. Another term that's used is, and I think I agree with most of the way people here have described consciousness as this first-person subjective experience. I do think that is also the way, that sense of consciousness that is trying to be, try to be captured amongst philosophers of mind. And there is a sense in the literature. It derives from a well-known paper by Thomas Nagel, published in 1974, called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And many since then have used that expression. There's something it's like to be either a person or in a mental state as a way of trying to get a handle on being in a conscious state. So I think this is what typically we want to try to explain, we want to try to understand. Not always very easy to do, of course, but that's what we're trying to get at, the subjective side of it. Now, materialism and dualism, of course, is another major division in the history of philosophy, theology, and so on. And there are, of course, many different forms of dualism, many different forms of materialism. For example, there's Cartesian dualism. Your mind is a non-physical substance distinct from your body entirely. And when he said non-physical, he really meant non-physical. He didn't just mean, not material in the brain, not physical at all. But I think that's been widely rejected through the centuries. Not for everybody, but especially in the West. But part of the reason for that is because then you have to try to explain the causal interaction, how you could have the causal interaction between a so-called non-physical mind and a physical body. And that has led many, even just that by itself, has led many to reject what's called substance dualism in many cases. There are other forms of dualism. Epiphenomenalism is one. But in a way, you have a similar problem, except you only have half of the causal relation to worry about. Then you've got to explain how does the non-physical cause, how does the physical cause the non-physical, and epiphenomenalism does, as I understand it, make consciousness causally inert, right? It does not in turn cause any thing. It sort of just comes along for the ride, so to speak, and that has led, of course, many to move away from some form of epiphenomenalism. On the other hand, you have materialism. Now, materialism is a narrower term, and I'll get back to this a little later. It's a narrower term than physicalism. Materialism, of course, would say that the conscious mind is it's material. Of course, in the West, especially, the most natural candidate for what that's going to be would be some sort of neural state. Of course, many people would disagree with that, or some neural process of some kind. But theoretically, a materialist could identify consciousness with something even at a lower level, but still material. And then there's a broader term. Sometimes you do find in the literature, there's some confusion about this. There's a broader term called physicalism, which would say that consciousness or mind is something physical. So that could be a broader, wider term. Some of the possibilities have been discussed at length at this conference, right? I mean, we're at a conference. It's called Toward a Science of Consciousness. And if it's going to be a science, right, it presumably has to have something to do with something that can be measured in physics, and maybe certainly in physics instead of at the neural level, perhaps, right? But still something that has some scientific sense to it. So it may be that identifying mental states, especially conscious mental states, with neural events doesn't eventually work for various reasons. Some might say, well, maybe we need to go to a different kind of physical substance or physical thing or level of explanation. And we've certainly heard quite a bit of that here, at some on the subcellular level. So the three questions that I'd like to focus on today, and it's the first one that also brings back that question of state consciousness that I mentioned earlier. The question that I think it's fair to say most, sort of in the most Western philosophers of mind working in consciousness are concerned to answer is that top question. What makes a mental state a conscious mental state? So sometimes we get lost in this consciousness. What's consciousness? How do we explain it? It's mysterious. And then we sort of forget that, well, if, and I think this is widely accepted, but if it is true that we want to allow for unconscious mental states, the question then, one way to frame the issue is to say, what is needed? What do we need to do, or what needs to occur in order to change, you might say, an unconscious mental state into a conscious mental state? And if you think about it at the very local state level, state consciousness, that's a way of thinking about the question. Presumably, I have all kinds of unconscious beliefs right now. I mean, just think of all of the mathematical beliefs I have. There's no way that I'm conscious of all of them. That'd be impossible. Now, if somebody says, asks me what is 10 plus 10, and I say, I believe it's 20, and or I know it's 20, I hope I would say, you might say that, that belief now is conscious. Before it was not conscious. And similar things are said all the time, right, about desires and perception, those kinds of things. Very often they are assumed by cognitive scientists and experimental scientists, some sorts of unconscious mental processing going on, but does not quite reach that level of consciousness. Another question that comes up then along those lines is how widely distributed in the brain are conscious states. And some of this has come up earlier in this conference. But also there's this sense that I believe one of the questions in the conference list is, what are the scales of consciousness? And you could read that as, how widely distributed are conscious states. And if we think of it in terms of the brain, if we are, we want to know how widely distributed. I mean, does consciousness permeate throughout for every kind of conscious state, and so on? And then finally, there's the question that I will spend some time on. Should hot theory, the higher order thought theory, require prefrontal cortical activity for first order conscious state? So a first order conscious state is a state that you have that's directed outward. It's world directed. So my visual perception right now of all of you is a first order conscious perception. If I have a desire for something to drink, or something like that, that's a first order desire. I'm not reflecting on it. My mind, you might say, my conscious mind is directed outward. And for reasons we'll see, I will answer that last question in the negative for reasons that I'll get to later. For one thing, it becomes very difficult to make sense of animal infant consciousness otherwise, which is something that I know most, at least, don't want to rule out. Higher order thought theory of consciousness is one of those theories that falls under the general heading of what's called representational theories of mind. And a representation, again, in the most general sense, a representation is just something that is about something else. Right? I mean, you could have nothing to do with mind as such or consciousness. It could be a photograph, even words, you might say, or symbols represent things. Certainly in cognitive science, computer terminology, robotics, they often talk about representations that are about things outside of them. And then sometimes the term that's used is intentionality. So some of our mental states have what's called intentionality. They are about things. They are directed at things, just like the example before about my visual perception or my desire for something. It's directed out. Now, some believe, it's hard to say how widely this is shared, and some it depends on the audience in some cases or the venues. But some believe that intentionality is a little bit easier to explain. You can explain perhaps more easily how it is that something comes to represent or be about something else in ways that don't involve necessarily consciousness, right? Because you have a lot of natural, examples of it. The rings inside of a tree represent the age, right? You don't get sort of tangled initially, people will say, in the consciousness problems of consciousness. And so the idea is that if we can give an account of representation with intentionality, then we'd be that much closer to what's sometimes called reducing consciousness to something. Now, again, the term reduction is another one of those terms that's very confusing, very ambiguous. Reduction doesn't means very different things, many different things. But generally speaking, the higher order thought theory attempts to reduce consciousness not directly in physical terms, but in what's sometimes called mentalistic terms. Right? So the higher order, for reasons we'll see. Now, of course, as is the subject of part of this talk, the question that always arises next is, well, then how do you think higher order thought theory might be realized in our brains or in something physical? And so then a hot theorist, and I think rightly so, should do some work there, right? If I think this theory is true, how might it be realized in the brain? And there are varieties of representationalism, but if you want a general definition, this is a very general definition of what's called representationalism. The phenomenal properties of experience, which, as we've heard, oftentimes refer to what the previous talk called qualia in the literature, can be explained in terms of the experience's representational properties. Now, that's a strong claim, but if it's true, then again you have this promise of explaining in a somewhat naturalistic, scientific way the nature of consciousness through the concept or the notion of representation. Now, what does the higher order of representationalism say? Well, there are many different kinds of representationalism. The higher order representationalist believes that, generally speaking, what makes a mental state conscious is that it is the object of some kind of higher order representation. A mental state M becomes conscious when there is a higher order representation of M. A higher order representation, another term that's used in the literature, is a metapsychological state. It just means a mental state directed at another mental state, right? Is all it means. So, for example, my desire to do a good presentation becomes conscious when I am non-inferentially aware of the desire. So I may have that desire unconsciously for bits of time, before the talk, during the talk, right? But if that desire is conscious, the theory says, well, I am aware of it in some sense, right? I mean, if I wasn't aware of it in any sense, it'd be hard to make sense of it as being conscious, right? I mean, and so the guiding principle, if you like, and one that I think most would agree with, even those people sometimes who are not higher order theorists, is this so-called transitivity principle that you find in especially the work of David Rosenthal and others. If you think about it this way, intuitively it seems that conscious states, as opposed to unconscious ones, are mental states that I'm aware of in some sense. Now, that aware of needs a lot of spelling out and what that amounts to, and is maybe intentionally a little vague, right? But I think on an intuitive level, if someone were to ask, so what makes your mental states conscious as opposed to unconscious? A higher order theorist is going to say, well, the conscious ones are the ones I'm aware of at the moment. The unconscious ones are the ones I'm not aware of at the moment. And it almost seems to many to be a sort of trivial truth, or sometimes philosophers will say conceptual truth, or a priori truth. So I hope that makes some sense. It's not necessarily the same thing as higher order thought theory, but it is part of what's going on in the thinking of a higher order theorist. There are two different versions, or two most common versions of higher order theory. I am much more disposed to believe in, to hold the higher order thought theory. But there's also something called the higher order perception theory. William Lycan, for example, holds that view. But for various reasons I won't get into today, I much prefer the higher order thought version. One reason that I do is that thoughts are generally considered to contain concepts, and I think to have a theory which allows or even explains the notion that the concepts we have can have a big impact on the very conscious states or perception that we have is very appealing to me and many people. So the higher order thoughts in question are thought of as cognitive states, right, directed. And philosophers do occasionally have figures and diagrams, not as many as the rest of you, but no physics experiments or anything like that. But this is one way, at least, of thinking about higher order thought theory. If you look down here, the higher order thought theorist argues that when you have a world-directed conscious state, say my current visual perception of all of you, what makes that conscious is there's a higher order thought directed at that consciousness. So that's for what's so-called first-order conscious states. If this state were to become unconscious, you wouldn't have this up there at all, and that's the way it's thought of. Now there are times, and it happens, I think very frequently, as was mentioned earlier in the week in a couple of talks, that we sort of bump it up a level, right? We do what's sometimes referred to introspection or reflection. And in that case, your conscious focus is not directed outward. Right? Your conscious attention is focused inward to a mental state. So the object of your conscious state, in that case, is another mental state. Right? So according to hot theory, what happens? What happens is this unconscious hot then itself becomes conscious. So you are consciously directing your mind toward a mental state. Now, of course, if the theory is right, whenever you have a conscious state, there needs to be an unconscious hot directed at it, another higher order thought, if you like, directed at it. And that's where you have, this is the way, at least, way to diagram what's going on. So you bump it up a level. Introspection occurs when that higher order thought itself becomes conscious, and then you have this sort of tiered or hierarchical picture, which I find appealing. Many people do, but it also seems to fit with the phenomenology. Sometimes our consciousness is directed outward, sometimes it's directed inward. This is just pretty much what I just said. You again, in the case of first order world-directed conscious states, the higher order thought itself is not conscious, but when you have introspection, it is also conscious. So if I am introspecting my belief of about something, then I am consciously thinking about my belief, and that would be a form of introspection. You turn your conscious attention inward. Now, I'm not going to say too much about this variation of hot theory, which I do hold. There are reasons I won't get into today why I think it's actually better to treat that higher order thought as part of a complex state. But I won't pursue that today. It's a view that I've called, as you see on top there. It's a view I've called the wide intrinsicality view. Sometimes it's called intrinsic hot theory. It just means that the hot is part of the same overall state as the conscious state. Two objections. There are many objections to higher order thought theory. I won't even mention a few. Obviously, I think, even though some are difficult, I think they can be replied to, mostly satisfactorily, but some are very difficult. This one, I think, is pretty easy to reply to, but it's worth bringing it up anyway, because it really helps, I think, to bring out an important feature of the theory. Some people say, well, isn't the theory circular? You're defining consciousness in terms of mental states and all this other stuff. And of course, the reply, as we've seen, is that when my first order, say, visual perception becomes conscious, it's not that I have a conscious hot that makes it conscious, it's an unconscious hot. So if you notice in that diagram, the top one is always unconscious, right? So there isn't this circularity, there isn't really a threat of regress, because that's another worry. Then you'd have to have an infinite series, and it would go on forever. That would be kind of crazy. So I think it really, instead of threatening hot theory, I think this really brings out a pretty important subtlety of any viable higher order theory. If one were to try to explain, what makes a mental state conscious by invoking another conscious state, well, then obviously, then you'd really have it looks like you'd have a circular argument or regress, or both. Another common objection, I won't say that common, but it comes up sometimes, is that perhaps animals are not likely to, or infants are not likely to have conscious states. So that would render animals and infant consciousness very unlikely. Now, most higher order theorists, with one notable exception, as I mentioned, most higher order theorists certainly do believe that infants and animals, or at least most animals, have conscious states. So certainly we don't want, and we don't hold that higher order theory should rule out animal or infant consciousness. And how do we do that? Well, there are various ways of doing it. In my book, I have a whole chapter on it, my last book. But one way to do it is to look at the experimental evidence, to look at even the neurophysiological evidence, and to try to explain and point out that under certain circumstances, it does seem like certain animals have, for example, mental concepts. They don't just have concepts perhaps about outer things, but even about inner things. So memories or those sorts of things. And if that's the case, and also higher order thoughts may not have to be as sophisticated as some people might think. You might think, oh, higher order thinking, that's so... Now again, we're not talking about introspection in every case, just any kind of higher order thought. There really doesn't seem to be any reason to doubt that animals can have those kinds of thoughts, even if they're much less sophisticated than ours, typically. Now, hot theory in the brain. My view is that hots, especially unconscious hots, need not occur in the prefrontal cortex. So although hot theory demands that conscious states be distributed to some degree in the brain, I opt for a more moderate global view with more limited neural connections. So there are, recurrent feedback loops in the brain. Sometimes I use and often cite Edelman and Tononi's work in that regard as sort of help myself to some of what they think about how, in trying to understand how, if hot theory is true, it might be realized in our brains. And this remains the case even on my modified version of the theory. Now, there is another theory sometimes called self-representationalism. And Uriah Kriegel, who has written a lot in this area, holds this view. And this view is similar to hot theory in the sense that there is a lot of reliance on the transitivity principle, on the notion that there's a higher order thought. However, self-representationalists hold that each conscious state is not only directed out, but it's also directed back at itself. Now, there are different versions of that as well, and I won't get into all the particulars there, but there are, for example, it would seem more worries about infinite regress and circularity, but also, also other problems with it that I think, I won't get into today. He does say, though, that consciousness will arise from the functional integration of first-order representations and external stimulus and second-order representation of the first-order representation. So according to Kriegel's theory, the self-representational theory, what are the neural correlates of consciousness? At the floor level, you need three. You need three. We need to know what three things fall in this group. A floor level representation, the higher order representation of one, and then a functional integration. But I think what's most important for my purposes is it's really crucial to note that on Kriegel's view, the higher order representations are themselves conscious, unlike on hot theory. So, it is not just Uriah Kriegel. There are higher order thought theorists who also identify the prefrontal cortex as a likely area of the brain, so-called neural correlate of consciousness, the likely area of the brain for higher order representation. Some hot theorists seem to agree even with that. Of course, we're talking about, here, and if you think about in the brain, you think about visual area, the visual cortex, just to use that example. And you do have, especially in the visual cortex, some very specific types of representational states, different spatial areas of the visual field, some neurons that are selectively sensitive to, say, shape and motion and so on. So my reply to Kriegel is that when he talks about his second element, the higher order element, that he actually seems to have in mind introspection. He seems to have in mind these really sophisticated abilities, like executive function and attentional control and so on. Now, it might be, here I might agree actually, that these higher capacities are indeed subserved by the prefrontal cortex. However, there's little or at least less reason to think that they are required for the usual run-of-the-mill first-order conscious states, like outer-directed conscious states. So on my view, this is an advantage for hot theory in this regard, with regard to the often cited problem of animal and infant consciousness as well, because if Kriegel's theory requires prefrontal cortical activity for all conscious states, and the hot theory doesn't, and hot theory is in a better position because with respect to this issue, because it is doubtful that infants and many animals at least have that prefrontal cortical activity. If we require that prefrontal cortical activity is present for just having any kind, even basic kinds of conscious states, that leads to this kind of problem. And so I, for example, have argued in various places that maybe we should think of his analysis more in terms of as an account of introspective states, rather than first-order conscious states. Ned Block, many of you know the name, has objected to a higher-order thought theory with these two claims. For example, he claims that the same order Kriegel view both fits science and common sense better than the higher-order thought view. Obviously, I disagree, but he also says this: since frontal areas are likely to govern higher-order thought, low frontal activity in newborn humans, and most animals may well indicate a lack of higher-order thoughts about genuine sensory experiences. Now, there's no surprise at this point. I mean, I disagree with Block on both counts, right? First, as we have seen, Kriegel's theory makes it more, not less, difficult to account for infant and animal consciousness. Moreover, the higher order representation for Kriegel is more sophisticated than unconscious HOTS. At the very least, he's not justified in dismissing hot theory without also rejecting the same order theory. Second, although I agree with Block that prefrontal cortical activity is not necessary for having first-order conscious states, I disagree with the claim that frontal areas are likely to govern higher-order thought. In short, hot theorists need not be committed to the view that prefrontal cortical activity is required for consciousness. Now, I have a lot more on these couple of slides than I'll be able to read out or go through, but there does seem to be a lot of evidence which, regardless of one's view, needs to be taken into account on this issue. So, just to give a couple of examples, there's plenty of evidence that conscious state does not seem to require prefrontal cortical activity. Even in cases of lobotomies, all conscious experience doesn't disappear. You have cases where transcranial magnetic stimulation is applied just in the visual cortical area and causes us to experience moving phosphenes, sort of images, right? And you get the similar kind of results for other modalities like auditory. And as I say, there are a lot of other cases. There's a well-known study recently by Rafi Malek, who had some people watching a movie, and maybe paying a little extra attention to what's outside, consciousness directed out, and very little prefrontal cortical activity. What is interesting is that when in experimental circumstances, though, is if those kinds of people are being asked questions about what they're experimenting on or seeing, then it tends to increase the prefrontal cortical activity. But my argument or my claim would be in those cases that what's leading to the prefrontal cortical activity is the sense of reporting. And reporting, of course, is something that is arguably more closely linked with introspection. You're thinking about what you're going to say, you're reflecting a little on the experience, then explain it after. And so, but just to have the first order experience, there's very little prefrontal cortical activity. Now, some people say, well, is there any positive evidence that at least unconscious HOTS can occur outside of the PFC? And I think, I'm running short of time, but I think the answer is yes. I rely quite a bit on this one paper here, Nguyen and Vogeli. So just to give some examples, they go through many, many experiments about levels of what they call self-consciousness. And they identify other brain areas more prominently mentioned: median and inferior parietal cortices, posterior cingulate cortex comes up, anterior cingulate cortex comes up a lot in studies about self-consciousness, introspection, mind reading, and so on. And those, of course, are not areas, the prefrontal area. So it looks like prefrontal cortex is not needed, which is good news for hot theories and for animals and babies and everybody else. So conclusion, it's a mistake, both philosophically and neurophysiologically, to hold that hot theories should treat first-order conscious states as very widely distributed in the brain, including the prefrontal cortex. Again, I invoke Edelman and Tononi at times for some help in terms of what would be going on at the first-order level, these feedback loops. To the extent that other higher-order theorists endorse the more global view, including prefrontal cortex, then I disagree. I will make this concession, although I don't think it's that much of a concession myself. It's a long conditional with 3 conjuncts in the antecedent, if you know the logical lingo. It is, I think I would allow that, I would concede this. If it is true that all HOTS occur in the prefrontal cortex and prefrontal cortical activity is necessary for all conscious experience, and if there's little or no prefrontal cortical activity in infants and most animals, then I would say you'd have to choose, right? You'd have to give one up. Either infants and most animals do not have conscious experience, or hot theory is false. And unlike some other hot theorists, if I ever became convinced that all three of those claims were really true, I'd be more inclined to give up the hot theory, not the claim that animals and infants are conscious. I feel like I'm much more sure that they are conscious than any philosophical theory of consciousness. It seems so much more obvious to me. So I'd be inclined. But I do think that I've made the case, and elsewhere have made the case, that at least one of those conjuncts, right, is false. And I think a good case can be made that are false. I have, if some of you are interested, I have some references, of course, that we can come back to. And that's a picture of my my latest book. And again, I really want to thank everyone, and Vishal especially, for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure being here. Thank you.
We now invite questions.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm just wondering if the higher order theory of thoughts is unconscious. Why do you call it thought?
Well, I mean, the short answer is they're constituted by concepts. So, of course, the question then becomes, how do we know when to attribute concept? Exactly. But, it's no different, I think, than why do we attribute unconscious first-order mental states to other people, right? There seems to be behavioral evidence that people have all kinds of unconscious beliefs or desires or things of that kind. So if there's third person and behavioral evidence, the first order unconscious, mental states, then it seems that, when you get to posit, if you like, or to at least assume for the sake of the argument initially that there are higher order but still unconscious thoughts, is not as much of a problem.
Thank you, Dr. Gennaro. I'm a little uneasy asking this question, but because of curiosity,
sure.
I would like to ask. I've heard of people remembering instances of past lives. And I've also heard, I've not personally witnessed, but I've heard of people being possessed by souls. Right. A, do you believe such phenomena exist? And B, how do you explain it? Is it an instance of creature or state consciousness? How does it really fit into this overall structure? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not sure that hot theory has anything very specific to say about the possibility of that sort of phenomenon. I'm personally a bit skeptical about many of the cases. However, I think one way to have it fit in a little bit and make some sense of it is if there is a way, a physical way, right, even at a lower level than the neural level, right, for consciousness in the sense of conscious states, like memories, right, episodic memories, to continue on without the creature, so to speak. It leaves open again that possibility that you could have, same conscious state, different creature entirely. You can even use other examples. People say the same about multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity, it's called now. So it leaves open that possibility. I'm not convinced myself, partly because I'm not sure what, how it all hangs together. How does the unity of consciousness continue, and how does it all work, right? I mean, who's in charge? It seems a bit. But I think hot theory is probably otherwise kind of neutral with respect to that. I don't think there's anything in hot theory as such that rules it out or rules it in. It's just a separate kind of phenomenon. Yeah.
Raise the question connected to artificial consciousness, and the question is, what is your view? What are the prospects of being able to implement something like higher order thoughts in an artificial system? And if so, I mean, some sort of representational states, and then if so, what are the prospects of artificial consciousness?
Yeah, I think that again, hot theory taken in and of itself is open to that possibility, right? Because You can say, talk about building a robot. You know, if we can get to a point where we agree and say, hey, there's unconscious mental representation going on, but then we can build, sort of add on in ways where you have higher order thoughts or higher order representations of those states, it may be possible to do. What I don't know, though, and I suspect could be the real issue, is to what extent is the biology that we have necessary for consciousness. So if the biology in some sense is necessary, not sufficient, but at least necessary for having conscious states, then it would seem like no matter how you do, you implement that figure and diagram into a machine, it's never going to be conscious because it's maybe not made of the right kind of stuff. Or just like someone might say about microtubules or other kinds of physical things that are in our brains, could you have artificial intelligence? It depends on whether or not those kinds of neural structures are necessary. And I'm not sure. My inclination is to think that biology, generally speaking, very generally speaking, is important to consciousness. But, in other words, even just to leave open the possibility of, people that are alien consciousness and organism. But there you're talking about biological creatures too. But when you're talking about robots, I'm a bit skeptical, but I don't rule it out automatically.
A quick follow-up there. Would you say that it's the intentionality or the aboutness that gives us consciousness in this theory? And doesn't the question then become, can we have intentionality or aboutness in a non-biological system?
Yeah, I think we can have that. The question is just whether or not the way that hot theory is realized in us is somehow necessary in other cases. But I also think there's a difference. Actually, me personally, I think there is a difference between some kinds of conscious states and others. I mean, we talk about robots. I think at least I have less of a problem, say, attributing to robots beliefs, knowledge, desires, even goals. But when it comes to things like emotions or pain states or things like that, I'm not so sure yet. Now it could just be because in 100 years maybe I would think something different. It could just be because it's hard to see right now how or what it would take for that to happen.
In your scheme of things, where would you place the transcendental meditationist state? The state that a transcendental meditationist has, where would you place it? There's different kinds of meditation, obviously, and I certainly don't know as much as most in this room on that point. But I think what you'd have is some forms of meditation that involve, directed focus outward, as we've heard at other speak. Then I would put that on the first order level. But it's being done in a very focused way. However, in the other cases, it would be on the introspective level, and I suspect that I think most would fit on that, would belong in that higher level where a person is meditating, thinking about their own mind, basically, and what's in their own mind. So I think in the vast majority of descriptions of meditations are of the introspective kind, and they're very focused. But I think there are some cases where people do talk about, being so focused on a small object, for hours, and I think that there your consciousness may be directed out. But most of the time, I think it's directed inward, right, at your own mind. Why does it have to have a brain state?
Why does it have to be a state?
You say that anything that has to do with consciousness in hot theory must have a corresponding brain state. Why?
Well, I mean, again, theoretically, a hot theorist could be a dualist, could hold a very different views. But I think it's because the state is something that we are familiar with taking as an object. So if I am introspecting my own belief, if I'm consciously thinking about my desire right now for something, then we can understand that relationship between the higher order and the object. But there may be states of mind, and I don't want to rule this out, there may be some states of mind that aren't as so easily captured by that notion.
You almost imply that the unconscious states are higher than the conscious states because they become conscious and then they have a higher status than the earlier conscious states. That is how you see it.
Yeah, I mean, higher is of course ambiguous, but when the term higher is used in higher order thought theory, all is meant by higher is, just a level, right?
In your diagram, you showed that there was an unconscious state,
right,
and that could become conscious, and that would be at a higher platform than the earlier conscious states.
That's right.
So this would seem to show that there are things which the brain had not been registering. Mm-hmm. It was unconscious.
That's right. That's right.
But one could still get if the person is alive, you could get the neurology of it.
Right.
So it's possible, but then it's a contrived thing. Why do you have to tie it up with neurology?
Well, as I said early in the talk, I mean, you really don't have to. But there is this, in at least the Western philosophy of mind and literature, there is this sense of, if you're going to defend a theory of consciousness that is sort of neutral with respect to that question, and then you see all of this research on neurology and neurophysiology, and you're interested in the brain like a lot of people, sometimes the question does come up and say, hey, look, let's even assume the theory is true. How do you see it realized in the brain? And I think that's a useful, interesting.
If you use Professor Capito's division in subjective and objective terms,
right,
then it would make sense that you want an objective evidence also for it.
right.
So neurology offers you an objective evidence.
It
so
allows,
long as the brain is alive. When the brain is not alive, the neurology will fail, whereas the subjective part remains.
right. Yeah, I think that's a good way to think of it.
So,
Yep.
I really didn't figure out where you stood. Whether you're a materialist, you believe that brain is responsible for consciousness, or you feel that brain only represents consciousness in a way. But when you use, and I'm more in sympathy with Professor Satsangi's point of view, that what you refer to as the subconscious is actually what we here would say is the supraconscious. In fact, before you have a thought, it doesn't exist in your brain at all. It's a possibility. Where's your vocabulary right now? You use it very selectively. Where is it right now?
Well, I think
Your entire vocabulary, your whole memory.
Well, I think there are brain storage. I think there is brain storage.
Well, I don't think there's even a
Yeah.
theory for the cellular representation of memory. There's no theory for that.
Well, I agree that
Quantum theory might be getting closer to that, which would say that before you actualize a thought, it's a probability field.
Right.
So, if consciousness is fundamental, then and universal, then all your thoughts, personal and collective, and perhaps even beyond that, are in the probability field till intention actualizes them, and then there's a brain representation. The thought still is not in the brain, it's in the field itself. And there's the sequential unfoldment of thought from para, pashanti, madhyama, vekhari, which would fit more with quantum theory, that your vocabulary right now is quantum entangled, or Manus's mathematical concepts, or your mathematical beliefs are in that field of quantum entanglement till you actually express them.
Well, I mean, the way I would put it, and I think it's fairly uncontroversial, but it may not be. Just that we have a lot of unconscious mental states, like the beliefs, the mathematical beliefs. So I think it's true to say of me when I'm sleeping that, hey, that guy over there, he knows that 2 plus 2 is 3. 2 plus 2 is 3. 2 plus 2 is 4. So he knows that 2 plus 2 is 4. Now, if that's a true statement, then you always ask the question, well, where is it, and so on and so forth. So I think we do have unconscious mental states, and if that's the case, I mean, there's priming experiments, right, that are done. There's subliminal perception and so on, where it looks like a case could be made that there's unconscious representation.
That's the obsession with measurement. The fact is that if you're not obsessed with measurement, if you take consciousness as fundamental, then I would be more in sympathy, not only with the Vedantic point of view, but Sufis who say consciousness sleeps in minerals, it dreams in plants, it starts to wake up in animals and infants, and then becomes self-aware in actualized human beings. But it's all a single field.
Yeah, my worry is just that if we take consciousness to be fundamental, at the very least, then it becomes, well, we can't explain it. That doesn't mean maybe we can't, and maybe we shouldn't even try. But my worry is that then, well, how are we going to differentiate between consciousness and conscious states and other things or other brain activity? And that's my concern. And I think it's at least worth, for the sake of argument, let's see how it might match up with what's in the brain. But as I said early on, someone could be a hot theorist and say, give a talk on hot theory and its quantum realization in the brain. Yeah, theoretically, that's possible. I just don't see how how it would work right now. And the neural level seems at least the better level for me and for my purposes here.